Boris Johnson claims he's got Brexit done. Is that anywhere near true?
Yes, we will have left the European Union at a minute past 11 tomorrow, midnight, Brussels time. And that's a very, very big deal. We might not notice very much, but we're no longer a member state. And actually the fundamental thing about that is, up until 11 o'clock, if the British government decides it's changed its mind, we can stop the whole process dead. As soon as we've left, it's a long, long road back in.
We've got a long road to get here. And the road to the next bit is actually quite short, isn't it, Maddy?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Boris Johnson has said that he doesn't want to extend the transition period. So the transition period is where, although we've left the EU, as Anand has said, we are going to continue to follow EU rules in most areas. But at the end of December this year, then we will be outside of the transition period and we will be sort of completely on our own at that point. And during that time, we need to negotiate a future relationship with the EU, but also get ready for what all of that entails in the UK. So 11 months, that's not a long time to negotiate with the EU, but it's also not very long for the government to get ready for what it means here, but also for businesses to get ready for a whole new trading relationship with the EU as well.
So taking it from February 1st onwards, the EU now needs to go away and decide what their mandate is going to be. And I think it's in March that they're going to...
End of Feb, they'll decide.
That they'll have that discussion about exactly what they're going to be doing during the trade talks. What do you envisage their strategy being for the next 6 months?
I think their strategy will be pretty much like their strategy in the first phase, which is to just sit and wait and say, OK, there are a variety of options, come tell us which one you want, which is how the EU negotiates. The EU doesn't usually negotiate with third countries. It usually says, this is what we're willing to offer, come and tell us what you want. And I think they'll treat us just the same way.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think one of the tactics also that the EU has is that it is a group of countries, so there are 27 member states. So actually in negotiations, it's quite hard for them to move because they'll say, well, you know, Germany doesn't want us to move on this, Italy has this problem. You know, they can sort of use the sort of collective power of those member states as a negotiating capital, whereas the UK doesn't quite have the same thing. And actually, because in particular, the government, there isn't going to be a vote in Parliament, for example, at the end of the treaty negotiations, the government can't use that in the same way to say, well, we can't give away on fish. It's going to be quite challenging for the UK government to have the same leverage in the talks as the EU will have. And
that's the paradox of the election, isn't it? Yeah. Loads of Brexiters said straight after the election, oh, he's got a massive majority, it makes him stronger. Actually, being weak at home is a really good thing in international negotiations because you can say, look, I'd love to give you that, but I mean, look at those nutters behind me. They won't let me. Yeah. Boris Johnson hasn't got that argument up his sleeve anymore.
Do you think there's been a lot of talk of the UK heading towards a Canada-style arrangement? Do you think that's a feasible outcome in the next 6 months?
No.
Also, please explain what a Canada-style.
Well, a Canada-style outcome is quite a detailed free trade agreement. So it's not bare bones, which is the phrase we all use nowadays. It's a lot more detailed than that. It's still well short of the kinds of agreements you have with, say, Norway. But it's a big agreement which requires a lot of scrutiny of the system. What the EU will want to do with anything we want is go over sector by sector what the implications are for their economy. And that takes time. So actually, I would say, well, I'd say two things about Canada. Firstly, it's quite tight to do it in the time. Secondly, the EU won't offer us Canada because we are bigger and nearer than Canada. And so what they've said is, if you want a deal like Canada has got, that's fine, but we're going to hedge it with all these conditions, the so-called level playing field. You've got to sign up to environmental standards, workers' rights. It's far from clear the government will do that. They might. The Tory manifesto doesn't rule it out, but you know, signing up to abide by EU laws and to adjust as they adjust is a big deal for a government that places so much emphasis on control.
Do you want to come in there, Maddy?
Yeah, well, I think, I agree with everything Anna said, and I think that's going to be one of the challenges, is that if to sort of get anything close to Canada, that the UK government might need to sign up to aligning with the EU, that might be a step too far for the government. And then it's sort of, we return to this issue of potentially a sort of no deal at the end of December 2020. And it is worth saying this is not the same no deal as at the end of sort of March last year or October. There are going to be certain issues that have been resolved in this sort of withdrawal negotiation. So citizens' rights will be protected. We will pay money to the EU. And we have committed to avoiding a hard border on the island of Ireland. But sort of in all the other areas, so security cooperation, economic cooperation for Great Britain, it will be very similar. And I think that's going to be, return to the agenda throughout this year is actually, are we going to get any kind of agreement at all? Because will the government be willing to make those concessions to get sort of goods access into the EU? And I think that's going to be a big question for them.
I was just going to say, the saving grace, if you can call it that, for the civil service and for businesses is that even the kind of deal that the government seems to be after is quite a thin deal. So they know the ballpark destination. That is to say, whatever happens this year, you've got to prepare for checks at the border. So that uncertainty has gone, which isn't going to please business because they don't want the checks in the first place. But they know what to be preparing for now.
Yeah. In terms of the politics here, and obviously this all comes back to politics, what kind of deal do you think Boris Johnson will be looking for in terms of how closely aligned we are with the European Union at the end of this? Because we know Boris Johnson talks a good game, and we know the Conservatives, many in the Conservative Party, ERG, etc., who want a kind of as clean a break as possible from the European Union. Do you think he will be going here for a kind of what we call a softer Brexit, or do you think he will trying to play to that crowd in the Conservative Party and say we're trying to leave, trying to go our own way as much as possible?
I do think it's quite difficult to predict at this point, but he has made it very clear that he doesn't want to be, for example, have the European Court of Justice overseeing anything in the UK. And if we aligned with EU rules in certain areas, then you can imagine the EU would very much press for the ECJ to have a role in that. You know, there are certain red lines that the Prime Minister has said he doesn't want to cross, and I do think it will be quite challenging for him to row back from that. Having said that, it's very difficult to predict what happens, and I don't have a crystal ball. I can't necessarily predict the outcome of Brexit, but I think at this stage it does feel quite unlikely we'll go for the softer Brexit. The question will be whether businesses actually get very, very concerned throughout the year, and whether they can start, I think, having an influence on the government to say, actually, this is going to introduce too much friction into how we operate, and actually softer Brexit is something we really prioritise, and then it'll be up for the government to decide whether or not they're going to be willing to listen to that. I don't know what Anand thinks.
You're absolutely right in the sense we don't know how this government is planning to govern.
Yeah,
and
that's kind of what I was getting at. We just don't know what
we don't know whether they prioritise their political objectives over their economic objectives in the Brexit process. We don't know how open they are to listen to businesses, because under Mrs May's government you had different phases. During some of the phases businesses were locked out, during others businesses were allowed in but not listened to. So we don't know what the style of this government will be. It seems to me it will be very, very hard for Boris Johnson to row back from the fundamental promises, which are no customs union, no single market. And if you think back to Mrs May's deal, that was a hard Brexit. It strikes me we're heading towards something significantly harder just because of the commitments that the Prime Minister has made.
One question that I've wondered for a while is, as we go into February, we've left the European Union, we're free to talk to whoever we want to. If we are having simultaneous trade talks with, say, the US and Japan, could that then also have an impact on the talks that we're having with the European Union? If the US say, look, we want you to do this on workers' rights, and the EU say, well, you can't do that because if you do that, we're not going to give you X, Y, and Z. How does the government juggle negotiating with multiple countries at the same time in the next 6 months?
It strikes me there are two issues. The first issue is any potential trading partner, the first question they'll ask us is, before we sign up to a trade deal with you, we'd quite like to know what your relationship with your largest trading partner is going to look like, because that will affect the stakes in the negotiations for us. So a lot of trading partners will say, hang on a sec, we need to know what you're doing with the EU. Because if you think about the Japanese, the reason the Japanese have invested so much in this country is partly, if not largely, because we give them access to the European market. So they'll need to know that answer first. So there's a slight chicken and egg thing. And then exactly as you said, there are trade-offs. If the US say, we'll only sign a trade deal if you let all our agricultural products in, the EU will say you can let all their agricultural products in, but you're not going to be trading agricultural products with us because our standards are much higher. So there are choices to be made.
And I just add to that, I mean, this is going to be something that I feel like it doesn't seem anyway at the moment that Cabinet has necessarily had that conversation. We are getting different messages from Cabinet ministers. And
the same minister sometimes.
Well, sometimes the same minister, exactly. And I think it's also what's going to be quite interesting is we have got a reshuffle coming up, potentially some changes in terms of how the makeup of departments. But if you've got Task Force Europe coming out of sort of number 10 Cabinet Office who are doing negotiations with Europe, but you've got the International Trade Department or the Business Department merged with the International Trade Department leading on negotiations with the rest of the world, it's not quite clear how those trade-offs and how those sort of different teams are going to be talking to each other either. And I think that's going to be quite important, just the mechanics of how all this works. And yes, that conversation in Cabinet is going to be really, really important, but also making sure that those teams are sort of talking to each other so that you're not promising one thing over here and promising something else. It's really important that the government can, just the mechanics of it, can figure out how to make those trade-offs. And it's, again, not quite clear whether they have got those processes in place, and that's going to be very important.
It's not something we've done before.
Can I just say something about this? I mean, people usually switch off when you talk about bureaucratic structures, but it's absolutely fundamental. This system has to work. If you end up with the negotiating team in number 10 being in somehow a silo, split off from the rest of the thing, you'll end up back where you were under Mrs May, with two teams not coordinating their objectives properly, and it all being a bit of a mess. Because when you do a trade deal, you need to bring the whole apparatus with you, because that trade deal affects health, transport, energy. You have to coordinate across Whitehall, and you need to have authority from number 10. And making that work properly is going to be fundamental.
And also, we're back to the politics here. Part of Boris Johnson's pitch to the voters in December was get Brexit done, i.e., I'll get this sorted. You're all bored of talking about it. You're sick of seeing it on the news. Let's move on and talk about other things. So over the next year, he'll want to not have us journalists and people out there not talking about this. He wants us to move on from it. And yet from this conversation, it's quite clear within government, this is going to be absolutely dominant.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that we already know that by March, there are going to be nearly 30,000 civil servants working on Brexit. As you know, we've talked about negotiations quite a lot. It's not just about negotiations. We've got to set up new policy, like domestic policies in areas like agriculture, fisheries, the environment. We are taking back control. And to do that, we then need to actually do something. So we need to get certain systems ready. So like public bodies are going to have to take on new responsibilities. We're going to have to pass legislation in Parliament. Now that's not going to prove the same problem it was for Theresa May, but it still takes time. And I do think that's the ultimate reality, is that actually a lot of the civil service are still going to be working on Brexit. They're going to have to make choices about when they communicate with businesses, about what changes are going to be needed. The government needs to get ready. And it's just, there's no way that it's all going to be done by December 2020. Even if we leave the EU at that point, there's still so much more to do. And I think that's going to be the reality, even though the politicians are not going to necessarily be talking about it. The civil servants are definitely going to be spending a lot of their energy.
And surely that will spill out. I mean, surely you can't just contain it within the civil service. Because we're going to be digging as journalists, and we're going to be talking about.
But with all due respect to journalists, I mean, this is accountancy rather than pantomime.
The first.
And journalists tend to like pantomime. I mean, one of the reasons why Brexit has been front and centre in the newspapers is because, it's been like a sitcom, hasn't it? You've got these characters, you've got these fights, you've got these divisions. That will still be going on, but not in the government itself, which it has been doing for 3.5 years. And so I suspect that in the short term, at least, the Prime Minister will manage to get this off the front pages, certainly. Not least because my guess would be that throughout February, and we've got the budget in March, there'll be a series of, flashy announcements about, there's a new train station opening in a seat we happen to have just won from the Labour Party by pure coincidence, or we're doing this, or we're levelling that. If they've got any sense, they've got a series of announcements ready for February to take the front pages. It'll come back onto the front page when we get near the deadline for asking for transition. But I think because this is a detailed story and a technical story, and it won't involve political fights, there's an 80-seat majority in a government that looks quite unified, it won't be quite as fun to report, and I suspect that might push it down in the newspaper.
Might get some sleep, though.
I think
you'll have to decide which story to run every day, though, which is a big change.
We're already in that world.
But no, I was just going to add, I mean, I think I found it fascinating, the coverage of the withdrawal agreement bill finally getting royal assent. And this was, the legislation that would allow us to leave the EU. And, at the end of last year, also all of 2019, Parliament on the front pages, there was so much activity. And then I think when it finally happened, it was sort of with a whimper, really.
Oh, yeah.
No one really acknowledged it. And, I talked about legislation going through, but, environmental groups are going to be keeping an eye on the environment bill and the agriculture bill, but it's not going to be as fun, because there's not going to be the same drama, because it should go through relatively easily.
My last question to you guys is, Boris Johnson's deadline is to get this done by December. Can he do it by then? Is it feasible that we negotiate a new trade deal with the European Union by the end of the year? Or is he going to have to ask for an extension to transition, something he said he's not willing to do? Or are we going to crash out with no deal? Which would you predict of those three outcomes are we heading towards?
Well, let me say several things about. There were lots of questions there. Firstly, if he wants to ask, in the past when we've asked for an extension, it's because the clock's been at sort of seconds to midnight. It's been, oh my God, we've got to ask for an extension. The rules this time say if you want to ask for an extension, you've got to do it by the end of June, which is long before seconds to midnight in terms of December. So actually the same dynamic won't apply. So it's a lot harder to ask for an extension. And if you miss that deadline, it's quite hard to extend, is the first thing. Yes, you can get a very, very simple trade deal negotiated and done with the European Union. It'll probably only cover goods. You've got to ask about what happens about services, what happens about counter-terrorism, police cooperation, military cooperation, foreign policy cooperation. We just do that later on. Do we just leave it?
Can I ask about that? Because in that scenario, we're saying here we'll have kind of, as you said earlier, a bare bones deal, and we'll kind of build on it as time goes on. How does that work? Because there's a sort of set parameters for a deal to be done. So effectively, in that scenario, we sign a deal, and then we do what? Just years and years keep going on. We just keep adding things on top of it. Is that what you're sort of suggesting?
Well, I mean, there are two suggestions about this. If we miss the transition extension deadline, the end of June, we could either say to the European Union, let's sign an agreement that allows us to maintain the status quo as far as possible while we negotiate a deal. The problem with that is it's still a deal. It still needs to be ratified by the European Union, so the same hurdles apply. Or the European Union, out of its own benevolence, says we will put in place mitigating measures to make sure freight continues to travel over borders, there are enough licenses, that air transport isn't affected by this. The problem with that is they are unilateral measures from the European Union to protect themselves, but they will reserve the right to withdraw at their convenience. It's not a deal with us, and it keeps us in a state of limbo and uncertainty.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think, I mean, that's sort of what the plan was for no deals in some of these areas, was having these sort of unilateral measures around, sort of air travel is one example. So I think that's the key point, right, is that you can do certain negotiations, you might be able to conclude them by the end of the year, but other negotiations are likely to continue beyond. And as Anna says, that there doesn't offer any sort of guarantees for business, because at any point the EU can withdraw those unilateral measures. And I think it's also quite important to say that normally when you have negotiated a trade deal, you then have an implementation period afterwards where you give time for businesses to adjust to the new status quo. Whereas at the moment, that's not anything that anyone's really floated. So there's a big question about how you sort of overnight massively change your relationship with the EU and how you're ready to do that on sort of New Year's Day 2021. I mean, that's sort of, there's quite a big question about how you manage that, and it's not quite clear what they're going to say there. And I think actually on the sort of a final point, what we haven't really talked about is the hurdles on the EU side in terms of getting anything done by the end of the year. And it all comes down to what type of agreement we have, whether we just have an agreement which covers areas that sort of EU has exclusive competence over, so it's just EU rules, or whether we try and do a deal that covers also member state rules, so shared competence. And in mixed agreements, which those sorts of agreements are, you need to have ratification in every single member state and follow their sort of constitutional requirements, which might involve votes in every single member state's parliament, sometimes regional parliaments, and that takes a lot of time. So there's quite a big question actually about what sort of how broad we're trying to go in terms of ensuring we can get a deal done by the end of the year. And if we do something like security, which is really important for the UK and the EU, that would definitely cover mixed sort of competence, and that would take longer to be able to sort of ratify on the EU side. So there are some quite big questions about how that all works as well.
If I'm not mistaken, there was that state that was blocking the Canada.
Wallonia in Belgium.
So we could potentially get into a situation where that happens with the UK.
Well, yeah, just bear in mind, this is the only trade deal in history whose sole purpose is to make trade harder. So actually selling wins at home to your parliament is going to be hard, because usually parliaments will say, okay, what are we getting out of this? What, we've given them cars, are we getting wine? Where does the trade-off lie? This will be, well, trade's slightly harder, but not quite so much harder in this sector as in that sector. And politically, that's quite a difficult sell.
Fascinating chat. We could actually talk about this all day, but we won't.